Hey there, my name is Lynn, and I am 56 years old, and I'm just starting to read classic literature. I am sure I read some back when I was in high school and in college, but I have like zero memory. I think maybe I read some Shakespeare in high school that I can recall, but that's it. I have zero memory really of reading classic literature. And I spent half of my career working as a corporate accountant. The other half of my career was as a registered nurse. And so I've been using my left brain. I've had to retire a couple of years ago for medical reasons, and I'm doing so much better now. But I'm still retired, and I figured I think I want to try to expand my mind and venture into an area that I haven't explored before. I think one of the impetuses is because it would be nice if I could say that word. Maybe if I read more classic literature, I will be able to say that word. But, anyways, I lost my mother to Alzheimer's disease, and she did live to be 91. We dealt with 11 years of her with her dementia and it progressing and progressing. And so, of course, I want to do everything I can to keep my mind very acutely like growing and developing those new neuronal connections. And so I figured, what better way to do that right now but by exploring an area of academia that I haven't ever explored. So I chose classic literature. And of course, because I don't ever just do things and let it be, I decided I'm going to make a video. I'm going to post it on my YouTube channel, and we're going to see where that goes. I don't know if anybody is interested in hearing what I think about classic literature, but I'll be interested to look back later sometime and see how little I know now, and hopefully I will know a lot more in the future. There are so many books that I have no clue what they're about, that they even exist. And I've always enjoyed reading, but yeah, I don't even know where to begin. Well, that's not true because I just finished my first book. But after this, I don't even know where I'm going to go, where this is going to go. I've bought some books and I've picked my second book, but I don't know what's good. I think that's what I'm trying to say. I don't know what's good and I don't know what's not good. And I think it's a matter of taste. So I guess I'm going to figure out what is my taste. But I decided for the first book that I was going to pick the first book by Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility. Now, I have finished reading it. And so if you are listening, perchance, and have not read Sense and Sensibility yet, this is not for you because I'm going to talk about things. So spoiler alerts, I'm going to talk about the story. So hopefully, if this is you trying to figure out if you want to read Sense and Sensibility, this is not going to be the right person to, unless you don't mind knowing the story. But I really like to be surprised, to be honest. So if it were me, I would want to listen to somebody recommend a book in much more vague terms. But I'm going to go into a little more detail and talk about the story because I want to share what my impression was, being that this is the first classic literature book that I can read in my memory. So anyways, I had bought this volume quite a while back at Barnes and Nobles, and part of it is because I love purple, and I know it is not by any means worth anything because it is a modern bound volume. But this contains her novels, and it also contains an introduction by a man named John Monshine, PhD. So I guess he knows a lot about her. But this book contains Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. Eventually, I'm going to get through all of these, but I decided to take a stab at Sense and Sensibility since it's the very first one in the book. And that's how much of this book I've read. All right, so I figured out fairly soon that I need to have my phone with me with Webster's Dictionary, the online version of Webster's Dictionary, because there are many words that I did not know. And I have 2 bachelor's degrees, so it's not like I have no education, but it's not in the area of English or literature. And so I have written in margins. I've got something right there that I wrote. I wrote a definition of demesne. I don't know if that's an actual pronunciation, but land attached to a mansion. Garret, a room or unfinished part of a house just under the roof. Some of the pages I don't have anything written on, but several of them I have quite, more than 1, 2, sometimes 3 definitions. So as far as the writing itself goes, I really found myself enjoying the quality of Jane Austen's writing. It is obviously from a very different era, and I really enjoyed just her grasp of the English language. Her vocabulary is next level. Now, there were some oddities about it. So, for example, some of the words that were, I would think would have been like present tense, she used past tense words, and there were some other things that grammatically didn't really make sense for what I know about grammar now. They may have been perfectly fine back when she wrote this book, which I believe was in the early 1900s, like in the 19 teens. So that was a little bit weird because I thought, is that a mistake? Because she used the wrong tense of this word. I don't know. Maybe if someone's watching this, they can tell me, is that just the way that they did grammar back then? But besides that kind of stuck out as being a really odd. Her vocabulary is just insane. And talk about being able to spend 4 or 5 lines of text just for one sentence to get one little thought out. You have to be paying attention while you're reading Jane Austen's writing, I found. You cannot let your attention stray because you'll probably end up reading the sentence over and over again. And sometimes even when my attention was still on the book, just to go back and figure out, am I really grasping what she's saying? I would have to go back and read the sentence over again. So I did see that the story progresses very slowly, and there is a lot of detail, just a lot of detail. And it's not just about the surroundings, but it's about the emotions of the characters, what they're thinking, how they're interpreting other people. And so I found that to be interesting, and I ended up enjoying it. I do believe it takes patience to read Jane Austen. You cannot expect a rushed story. And I found myself enjoying that because I decided that I was really liking getting immersed into all the description and feeling like I was really getting to know her characters and seeing the actual differences between her characters. So I do appreciate the fact that she spends a lot of time developing her characters so that we can really get to know them. And so I want to talk a little bit about my impression of her characters because they are all different and have different personalities. And just the era, too, was very interesting. It makes me wonder if, is this the way it really was back in the early 1900s in England, where the setting of the story is? So you're dealing with Mrs. Dashwood. Mr. Dashwood passes away. Her stepson, which is his son from a previous marriage, inherits everything because daughters can't inherit. He has a deathbed promise to his father to take care of his half-sisters, and then his father dies. And they live in this big, beautiful house. He is already married and has his wife, who's awful, Fanny Dashwood. But it was just interesting how easily Jane Austen shows through a conversation with Fanny and her husband how quickly he goes from promising his father that he would make sure he takes care of them. And by doing that, that means having like a monthly allowance of money, providing a monthly income for them. And I think from what I can recall, he started out at like $2,000. And his wife was to have nothing of that. And she talked him very manipulatively around basically giving them nothing. And how she just kind of like little by little by little eases him back away from that $2,000 and like, well, maybe $1,500. Like, what women could need more than $1,500? Oh, maybe this. It reminded me in the Old Testament in the Bible of Abraham, I think it was before he became Abraham, kind of negotiating with God. God wanted us to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and he was saying, well, if you find like 50 people there that are like faithful to you, that love you, can you spare Sodom and Gomorrah? And God said yes. And then he's like, well, but what if there's 40? But what if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? So that was kind of the same type of dialogue that was going on between the son and his wife. And she basically just convinced him not to give them anything, which tells me about his character that he didn't want to anyways. He was doing it just out of obligation because he was making a promise to his dad on his deathbed. So so his Fanny, the sister-in-law, was not portrayed well at all throughout the story. But you've got the three daughters, and they're, I think, like Eleanor is 19 and Marianne is 17 and Margaret is 13, I think. And you can tell the distinct difference in their personalities. Eleanor is the more reserved one. Marianne is more carefree. Margaret's just still kind of a child. But Eleanor is so proper. Like, she's so concerned about what, not offending anybody. And like, there's just things you don't talk about. You're reserved. And anyways, as I was reading through this, I knew there was a movie made out of this back in 1995. And I know the cast of characters, several of which I knew. I knew Kate Winslet was in the movie. And so the whole time I was reading this book, I was imagining her as Eleanor. Now, I'm going to do a separate video to share my impressions of the movie versus the book. So I did, as soon as I finished reading the book, I went and watched the movie. And I was surprised to see that Kate Winslet was Marianne, because I was thinking of her in her very proper role from the Titanic as Rose, and how she was very prim and proper and very much just composed. And it just reminded me, the character that she played on Titanic reminded me more of Eleanor, but she didn't play Eleanor. But anyways, the way that the sisters are portrayed, I think, is really clear. And the fact that Eleanor is your typical older sister that is just kind of the watching over her younger sisters, particularly Marianne, and how she's, one of the impressions I got too throughout the story of both Marianne and Eleanor is that they just didn't seem to like socializing. Like, every time they got invited to something, they were always turning it down, but yet they'd end up going eventually anyways. And so you've got those characters, and Marianne, the carefree spirit, she plays music and she's very much into reading, and so she's just the more of the right-brained sister, whereas Eleanor is the mother hen. But then you have Edward Ferrars, and he is Wicked's half-sister-in-law or stepsister and sister-in-law's brother. Seems to be something going on with Eleanor, but he's portrayed as this person who's a little socially awkward, and no one ever tells anybody if they're interested. And one of the funny things I found about the way Jane Austen presents these characters is they jump to conclusions that someone's engaged when there really is no engagement going on. And it's like, well, this person told me that she saw this man look at her in a certain way, and so therefore they're engaged. Was that how it was back then? It's like you just don't talk about it. Even the mother, when they were after Marianne met John Willoughby, and they were spending all this time together, and Eleanor thought that maybe they might be engaged, and she asked her mother, like, "Are they engaged? What are you?" The mother was like, "I'm not going to ask." It's almost kind of like they're going, "Well, you ask. No, you ask," even though that wasn't the conversation. But it's like they won't ask. They won't bring it up. Like, seriously, if it was my sister, and nowadays, the way things are nowadays, it would be like, not only would you wouldn't have to ask, because they would probably plan the engagement so that you're filming it for social media, and there's family waiting in the wings or there. And yeah, engagements nowadays, or maybe there's like a flash mob going on. It's so different. And honestly, it seems like even the person who's supposed to be engaged doesn't always know if they're engaged. They think they are, but they're not really sure. So it's like, I'm sorry, but I found that to be really humorous, because it's so different than things are nowadays. And I'm just so curious to know if this is just Jane Austen, or if that is just part of the way this era of literature is. Is this how people were? I don't know. But that was something that was I found really humorous in the story. But it contributed to so much misunderstanding among people. Everyone thought that Eleanor was engaged to Edward. Everyone thought that Marianne is engaged to Willoughby. I think Marianne thought she was engaged to Willoughby. He was kind of made out to be kind of like a playboy. And it turns out that he really was. But whereas Edward Ferrars was conservative and more proper, but so kind of socially awkward. Colonel Brandon also portrayed as socially awkward as well. And I thought it was really hilarious that they were thinking him so old, and he's 35. But I guess at that point, when you're 35 and you're not married, you're old. And apparently they couldn't even imagine somebody at age 35 falling in love and getting married. So another very different cultural situation, a scenario than now, because now so many people are waiting to get married. And a lot of times they don't even get married until they're in their 30s. And that's like no big deal. Not then. You're talking about getting married, especially if you're a female, apparently when you're a teenager. That's not unheard of. So anyways, the male characters were interesting, and Willoughby was definitely the more charismatic of all of those characters. And Mrs. Jennings was probably, in my eyes, more like a person might be today, because she was inquisitive, she was outspoken, she was very outgoing and exuberant, and there was nothing off the table to talk about, which Eleanor was not happy with that. She thought that was very kind of lower class. I guess the classes, if you're going to be classy, you have this decorum and you don't talk about certain things. But Mrs. Jennings would talk about anything. But she was also a very, very kind and generous woman, and which played out in the story that she did end up finally, they ended up liking her, because she was such a wonderful person for them, and really like took them in and make them part of her life. And her daughter, Charlotte Palmer, initially, the way it was written, I thought she was really obese, but it turns out she was pregnant. So is that something that you don't talk about when you're living in the early 1900s? You don't talk about pregnancy, apparently. because I just thought that Charlotte Palmer was a really chunky woman. And it turns out that she was pregnant. And so that was a kind of a surprise for me, too. Um, John Middleton, Lady Middleton, the ones who provided them with their cottage. In their cottage, I imagine a tiny itty bitty little like house with maybe 2 bedrooms, but apparently this was a pretty decent sized place. But it was considered a cottage by their standpoint. But they were cousins of Mrs. Dashwood, the girl's mother. John Middleton was her cousin, and so he was very gracious and generous and provided them with this cottage to live in. And they made it their home. They made it a very welcoming place, but it was expected that they were to come over and spend time with the Middletons. Lady Middleton seemed incredibly self-absorbed. If it wasn't about her children and her, she wasn't interested. So very, very distinct characters, whereas John Middleton was a kind, generous man. He was one of the nice ones. But like Charlotte Palmer, which is Charlotte was Mrs. Jennings' daughter, was her husband was like rude, outright rude, and like I just kind of wondered if like he's this typical man who has realized that he's married a really flighty woman because she's like her mother, just talkative, and nothing is off the table. They're kind of like two peas in a pod, and he seems like he's just like barely tolerating being around them. So he definitely has his own distinct personality, and so yeah, there's like this whole kind of little bit of a family going on here, because Mrs. Jennings is, my understanding is, she is Lady Middleton's mother, so John Middleton's mother-in-law. Anyways, they're all family, and Colonel Brandon is their friend. So then you end up with a couple of more particularly one more key character, which is Lucy Steele, and there's the Steele sisters who end up being guests with the Middletons. From what I can recall, I think it's with the Middletons. But anyways, then Lucy Steele ends up being a key character. She comes across as being like not as pretty as the Dashwood sisters. The Dashwood sisters are portrayed as being very, very beautiful, and they're wanted to participate in society. And Mrs. Jennings is the matchmaker. She's always wanting everybody to get matched up, and is just so happy when she thinks that there's a prospect for someone, and she's got them picked out ahead of time. But Lucy Steele, it's interesting with Eleanor, because this is kind of goes with Eleanor like not liking people. Like Lucy Steele really wants to be friends with the Dashwood sisters. She confides in Eleanor, and this is the spoiler. She confides in Eleanor that she's actually been engaged to Edward for 4 years. And here Eleanor thinks that her and Edward are going to be getting married, and she thinks that he has interest in her and that they might get engaged. And then she finds out that he's been engaged for 4 years to this Lucy girl. And Lucy is, I guess, not as pretty as Eleanor, not as dignified as Eleanor, not as composed as Eleanor. And Lucy doesn't know that there's something going on in Eleanor's mind between her and Edward. And so here Eleanor is, her heart gets broken, because she thought she was going to marry Edward, and then all of a sudden finds out he's engaged to Lucy. He never said a word to her. And so she's dealing with a broken heart at the same time that Marianne is dealing with a broken heart about John Willoughby. And I won't talk too much about why, because if you've read the book, you know why. But I was very touched by one of the scenes in the book. And as you know, if you read this book, how much despair Marianne goes into when she realizes that John Willoughby basically gives her the cold shoulder, and then finds out that he's supposed to marry Miss Grey, who has money. And he's she's very heartbroken to the point of where she is in absolute despair, unhealthy despair, and she's so self-absorbed. And honestly, when I was reading all of her self-absorption, I was like, really? Like, I get it. Grieve and be sad, but have a little bit of self-respect. My goodness. Get over, at least move on. And I know Eleanor in the story was talking about her exerting herself. That's the terminology that was used, is that she was trying to get her to exert herself, which means try. Like, don't just wallow around in despair and misery. Try. Like, have a little bit of dignity and self-respect and get out there and socialize and take care of your mental health, basically. But she was just an absolute basket case. And the whole time not knowing that Eleanor's heart was broken as well. And Eleanor, of course, didn't say a word. Her whole everything was about protecting her sister and helping her sister not feel worse than she already did. And so for me, a real key part of the book was when Marianne finally learns about Edward's engagement to Lucy and how heartbroken Eleanor has been. And it's like she has an epiphany that she's been so self-absorbed that she hasn't even noticed or realized that her sister's heart is broken. And she was actually really mean to Eleanor, basically saying, you couldn't understand because you're happy. But Eleanor could understand. And so the part where Marianne comes to that realization that all that Eleanor has given up by not being able to grieve, not being able to have anybody there for her, Marianne has a change of character. And to me, that's a really pivotal point in this story, is the change and the growth in Marianne that occurred from that realization, and how she, from that point on, she did exert herself and try to think of someone other than herself and try to recover from her grief and try to let herself be open to a life that wasn't just misery over losing John Willoughby. So I think that's all I'm going to say about the book right now. I know I've gone on a lot, and I know that when it comes to these stories, at least this one I read, there's so much involved in it. But my impression that I was left with is it did take me a little while to get into the story. But once I got into the story, I was definitely hooked. I had a difficult time putting it down. I'm really glad that the chapters were short, because I'd read one chapter and I'm like, okay, I'm going to read another. Oh, what comes next? Oh, I'm going to read another. And that's basically how I progressed through this book. It is a total of 50. Yeah, I think 50 chapters. And of course, the farther you get into it, the more the story picks up and the more you see what's going on with the characters and you want to keep reading. So I started this story not sure if I was going to like Jane Austen, if I was going to want to read more of Jane Austen. Now that I understand her writing style, and I have seen how she develops her characters, how her stories do progress slowly, but how they do progress, and you end up with very emotional characters and very relatable life situations, and you can really feel for the characters in the story. I like that. I really do like a character-driven story. That's what I love in movies too. I really do like things that are character-driven. I now know that I will read Jane Austen again. I do plan. I'm not going to read through all 6 of her novels before I start something else. That's kind of a lot. I am going to read other things in between, but eventually make my way through this whole volume of Jane Austen's novels. And and it is still a very pretty book. Purple's my favorite color, so I did like the binding on this book, and I do like the gold on the outside, and it has a bright pink fuchsia colored ribbon marker. So I kept that marker the whole time I was reading. I kept it between, at the very end, between Sense and Sensibility and where Pride and Prejudice starts, so that I would know where the book ended, and I had a different bookmark in there. But anyways, so that was my first venture into reading classic literature, and I'm really, really glad I did. So I did go to Half Price Books, which I know is not the mecca of buying classic literature, or maybe it is, I don't know, but I got a little frustrated because I was hoping they'd have an actual classic literature section, and they don't. All of their classic literature is in the fiction section, just sorted by author last name. And for me, where I don't really know a whole lot about classic literature, I'm like, I don't know who to look for. So I looked up some things. I bought a bunch of books, and I found out, now this is just after, so to me this is my first venture into classic literature in my mind, but I didn't realize that one of the things that I have read already, is classic literature. And I figured out that if there's a couple things. I've read Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. So it's like, oh, wow, yeah, I did actually read something that was considered classic literature. I had no idea. And I've read an abridged version of Les Mis, but I did not read the actual Les Mis. So that might count. I don't know if that counts or not. I don't know. I guess my question is, for if anyone's watching this and you are a buff of classic literature, did you have to read the original? I mean, I realize if it's in a different language, you read a translation, but does an abridged version count? I don't know. So I don't know if I can count Les Mis as a one that I read, but Anna Karenina, I have it back here. Let me see. So this is the version of Anna Karenina I read. It was given to me by my mother-in-law, and it was translated by Richard Pevier and Larissa Volonkonsky. So this is the version, the translation that I read. And so maybe if anyone does end up watching this and you're interested in hearing my thoughts on Anna Karenina, I will do a video on that, and I'll probably have to go back and skim it again because it's been a little while since I've read it. But anyways, I did pick up a volume, which I have actually already started. I've read the first few chapters, but I was in Half Price Books. I still have the price tags on it, but it came in this little box. So I pulled out the box, and here's this book. It has this coat of arms on it that says Vivat Ruritania, and the name of the book is The Prisoner of Zenda. Never heard of it. And in the beginning of the book, it has this little pamphlet here called the Heritage Club Sand Glass, and this whole pamphlet is a write-up about this book. And so this book is by an author named Anthony Hope. It was written in, I believe, 1894. So it's a little bit older than the Jane Austen books. And it is about a fictitious country called Ruritania. And I guess according to the little brochure that I read, this coat of arms is just a fictitious. They made it up for the book. But I have read the first several chapters, and I'm getting hooked. It's going to be a fun story. So far, it is entertaining. It has humor in it. I'm liking his writing style. So when I'm done with this, maybe I'll do another video and I'll share what I learned about this book. But very different writing style from Jane Austen. Much more fast moving, and it's more action, less character driven and more action. So it's kind of a nice in-between book. It's a little bit lighter reading, I think. So far it is. But anyways, that's my next reading project. So anyways, that's it for this video. Again, my very first video on reading any classic books. So I'm so super curious to see if anybody watches this and if anybody comments. And I'm really looking forward to hearing people's thoughts, what they thought about my dive into Jane Austen. So okay, that's it. I hope everyone's having a wonderful day. Bye-bye.